Hey guys, tonight we drift into the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, France's most ambitious emperor. Though to be fair, if ambition could be bottled, this guy would have chugged it straight from the barrel. Start on the island of Corsica. In the Mediterranean, the waves crash softly against rocky shores, olive trees sway in the wind, and a wiry, sharp-eyed boy grows up in a place that's both rugged and remote. It's 1769, and Corsica has just been swallowed into French control. So technically he's born French, but if you'd asked his neighbors, they'd have insisted they were stubbornly Corsican first. Imagine being born into a family that tells you daily how proud they are of independence, only to find yourself suddenly labeled a citizen of the very country they resent. Yeah, family dinners were probably fun, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture little Napoleon, called Napoleon in the local dialect, a boy who preferred the company of books to playground antics. He wasn't much taller than his peers at that time, but later, oh boy, would people gossip endlessly about his height. Spoiler alert, he wasn't actually unusually short. His height was average for the time. The myth stuck because mocking. An emperor's stature feels like a cheap shot no one could resist. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer with a fondness for politics and maneuvering, while his mother, Letizia, was a strict disciplinarian who kept the household in line. With an iron will, historians still argue whether her stern guidance or his father's political hustling had more influence on young Napoleon's hunger for power. Either way, he grew up in a family where ambition was baked into breakfast like fresh bread. Napoleon learned early that Corsica was a place of rebels and dreamers. The local hero, Pasquale Paoli, had led resistance against the French, and young Napoleon idolized him like kids today idolize superheroes. He scribbled essays about liberty and independence, painting France as the great oppressor. Imagine this. The boy who would later conquer half of Europe once wrote passionately about resisting France's domination. Awkward life in Ajaccio, the town where he grew up, wasn't glamorous. Streets were dusty, goats wandered freely, and the family home was comfortable but hardly palatial. You walk those narrow alleys, and you can almost hear a young Napoleon pacing, muttering under his breath, already plotting something bigger. He wasn't the most social child, often teased for his accent when he later studied in mainland France. In Corsica, though, he was just another kid with a wild imagination and a fiery temper. Quirky fact, his mom gave birth to him on a thin mattress, spread on the floor because she believed it was the way Roman women gave birth, close to the ground, close to strength. If you're thinking that sounds a little theatrical, well, consider it foreshadowing. At age 9, Napoleon left Corsica for France. Imagine that boat ride, a seasick little boy, clutching his cloak too tightly, heading toward a land he technically belonged to, but didn't quite feel part of. He was shipped off to a military school in Brienne-le-Château. Here's where the teasing began. His Corsican accent was thick, his French wasn't perfect, and his classmates looked down on him as an outsider. Instead of crying about it, though, Napoleon doubled down on books, math, and history. He found comfort in the orderliness of numbers and the drama of Caesar's campaigns. He devoured tales of Alexander the Great, secretly rehearsing how he might outshine him one day. Scholars debate whether his outsider status hardened his resolve, or whether he simply had that innate drive from the start. Either way, you can picture him hunched over candlelight, nose deep in Plutarch's Lives, imagining himself as more than just a Corsican boy mocked for his accent. He would one day show them all. The strict winters of northern France were a far cry from Corsican breezes. Picture Napoleon trudging through snow, shivering, mumbling that one day he'd command thousands of men across battlefields instead of carrying his books alone. He wasn't joking. The resilience he built in these years became the bedrock of his later career, and let's not gloss over the fact that young Napoleon was awkward in social gatherings, preferring to lecture his classmates about Roman history rather than flirt at dances. Smooth moves. But his brain was sharper than his social skills, and that was enough to catch the eye of his teachers. By 15, he transferred to the École Militaire in Paris, the prestigious academy that trained officers. Imagine walking into the bustling capital as a teenager from Corsica. Grand boulevards, powdered wigs, and an endless parade of sophistication he had only read about. He studied artillery, the branch of the military considered both scientific and unglamorous. But Napoleon, ever the contrarian, saw its potential. Big guns, precise math, and the ability to change the tide of battle, yes. Please, historians still argue whether his choice of artillery was pure genius foresight or just a practical move since it had openings. Either way, Napoleon excelled. By the time his father died in 1785, leaving the family strapped for cash, Napoleon was already commissioned as a second lieutenant, teenage officer in the French army, ready to begin the climb. Corsica never left him, though. Each time he returned home, he felt torn between loyalty to his island and ambition in France. At one point, even toyed with the idea of supporting Corsican independence against Paris. Imagine the alternate timeline. Napoleon, the Corsican rebel, not Napoleon, the French emperor. Historians love to play with that what if, and honestly, it would have made for a very different bedtime story as you drift further. Picture him standing on a cliffside in Corsica, salty wind in his hair, staring out at the horizon. He's restless, caught between two worlds, already thinking in terms of destiny. The boy is on his way to becoming a man whose ambition would stretch far beyond the island's shores. Asterisk, you step into Napoleon's early officer years, and it feels like walking into a world of powder smoke, brass buttons, and endless drilling on parade grounds. By the late 1780s, France itself is wobbling like an overloaded cart. Political tensions. Starving peasants and an aristocracy, still convinced wigs 3 feet tall are a good look. Into this mess wanders our young Corsican lieutenant Still, with an accent thick enough to earn snickers behind his back, but armed with a mind that could calculate the trajectory of a cannonball faster than you could say duck. He was posted to various garrisons, some in sleepy provincial towns where boredom weighed heavier than the muskets. Imagine him pacing through gray barracks in Exile, the rain soaking the courtyard while he dreams of battles that don't exist yet. He kept journals, scribbling thoughts on politics, military theory, and even half-baked novels. One of them, Clisson and Eugenie, was a melodramatic romance about doomed lovers. Think of it as Napoleon's teenage fan fiction, era-proof, that even the future emperor once scribbled angsty drafts by candlelight. Here's the quirky bit. During this time, Napoleon spent more money on books than on food. His fellow officers complained about wages being low, while he spent his spare coins hoarding volumes of history and philosophy. Picture him lugging a stack of books taller than his head, muttering about Julius Caesar while his comrades just wanted to play cards. And yet, the world around him was about to change dramatically. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The Bastille was stormed, the monarchy trembled, and suddenly, being an ambitious young officer wasn't just a career, it was a ticket to ride the chaos. Napoleon, with his Corsican background, actually sympathized with the revolutionaries at first. Quality, merit over birth. The end of aristocrats bossing everyone around these ideas suited a man mocked for his accent. But back home, Corsica was still tugging at his loyalties. He returned to the island and flirted with revolutionary ideals there, even aligning for a time with Pasquale Paoli, his old childhood hero. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's loyalty to Corsica in these years was heartfelt or just pragmatic, posturing while he figured out which way the winds of power would blow. Either way, the partnership soured. Paoli leaned toward Britain when France became too radical, and Napoleon ever ambitious leaned toward France. That split with his island roots hurt deeply, but it also freed him to throw himself fully into French affairs. Fast forward to 1793. You're standing in Toulon, southern port city in open revolt against the French Republic, backed by British ships. The air stinks of salt, smoke, and cordite. Napoleon, just 24, is assigned as an artillery officer here. It's the first time his talents get noticed on a big stage. The French army is a disorganized mess, but Napoleon sees opportunity. He drafts bold plans, move the big guns into position, target the harbor, force the British fleet out. While older generals argue, this young upstart sketches maps and insists his plan will work. You find yourself stepping off a ship in the scorching heat of Alexandria. July 1798. The air tastes of salt and dust, and the city looms with its ancient ruins and teeming bazaars. Napoleon has brought you here not because Egypt is the natural next step after Italy, but because he has a plan, at least he claims he does. The British control the seas, the Ottomans rule the land, and France. Well, France needs a dramatic distraction. Egypt, with its pyramids, pharaohs, and fabled trade routes, seems exotic enough to keep everyone busy. Besides, Napoleon dreams of cutting off Britain from India, like some elaborate board game move. The expedition is unlike anything Europe has seen. Along with 35,000 soldiers, Napoleon brings over 150 scientists, scholars, artists, and even a balloonist. Yes, really, a balloonist? Because hot air balloons are apparently useful for science and intimidation? This strange entourage becomes known as the savants. It's their job. Study everything: plants, animals, languages, ruins. So while soldiers sweat in the desert, professors sketch hieroglyphics and measure mummies, might think this sounds like a chaotic school field trip. You wouldn't be wrong. One of the most iconic moments comes quickly: the Battle of the Pyramids. Picture it: you squint at the blazing desert sun, sand whipping at your face. French squares of infantry stand firm like human fortresses, while Mamluk cavalry glittering in armor. Scimitars flashing charge with terrifying speed. Napoleon points to the pyramids in the distance and declares, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids 40 centuries look down upon you." It's the kind of line that could only come from a man who secretly wishes he was narrating a movie trailer. The French hold, the Mamluks fall, and the legend of Napoleon grows. But not everything is glorious. Just weeks later, the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay is obliterated by Admiral Horatio Nelson. Cannons roar, ships burn, and suddenly Napoleon's army is stranded in Egypt, unable to return home easily. Imagine being one of those soldiers, sipping warm Nile water, realizing you've traded Italian wine for camel rations. The dream of empire feels a bit sandy. Quirky tidbit: Napoleon, ever the dramatist, reportedly rode a camel through the desert while wearing a full uniform. His soldiers laughed because he looked more like a child on a stubborn pony than a general of destiny. He also hated the heat, swatting at flies and muttering curses. Soldiers whispered that maybe their general's star was dimming under the Egyptian sun. Yet the Egyptian campaign wasn't just about fighting. It gave birth to the monumental description de l'Egypte, a massive scholarly work cataloging the land's wonders, most famously in 1799. Soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone slab that would later unlock the secret of hieroglyphics. Imagine stumbling across it, half buried in dust, with no idea it would change the study of history forever. Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly cared about science here, or if the scholars were just window dressing for his military ambitions. Still, battles dragged on. Napoleon marched into Syria, hoping to topple Ottoman rule, but the expedition faltered. Plague broke out, and the French army staggered like ghosts. One notorious scene shows Napoleon visiting plague-stricken soldiers in Jaffa, touching them dramatically as if immune to sickness. Later, rumors suggested he ordered some poisoned with opium to spare them suffering, a claim historians still debate fiercely. Was it mercy, cruelty, or simply rumor spun into legend? And then, as if things weren't chaotic enough, Napoleon quietly abandoned the expedition. Yes, you heard that right. In August 1799, leaving his army behind, he slipped back to France on a fast ship. One day you're following him through sandstorms, the next poof he's gone, like the world's most dramatic magician's trick. The soldiers left behind felt betrayed, but back in Paris, Napoleon spun the tale differently. He returned, not as the man who stranded thousands, but as the conquering hero ready to save France from its faltering government. The strangest part: his departure worked. By the time he set foot in Paris, news of the Egyptian fiasco was muffled under reports of his earlier victories and his undeniable charisma. People didn't ask too many questions about what happened to the thousands still. Sweltering under the Egyptian sun, the myth of Napoleon remained polished, if a little sandy so. Egypt gave Napoleon both glory and shame, victories remembered in paintings, disasters whispered in the shadows, and scientific treasures that outlived him. You can almost feel the desert heat clinging to your clothes as he boards that ship home, leaving both pyramids and soldiers behind. Ahead of him lies France, ripe for another transformation, and this time, not as a general, but as something far bigger. Asterisk, you trail Napoleon back to France, brushing off the desert sand, only to find Paris buzzing with discontent. The government. Of the Directory, 5 directors trying to hold together a shaky republic has all the stability of a chair with 2 legs. Corruption, inflation, constant war, and food shortages gnaw at the city. People are tired. France needs anyone who can promise order, and Napoleon, fresh off the boat from Egypt, steps into this moment like a man stepping onto a stage. It's November 1799. The air is crisp, streets echo with horse hooves, and whispers of conspiracy hang thick. Napoleon teams up with his political allies, including Emmanuel Size, the man famous for writing What is the Third Estate, a pamphlet that had once lit revolutionary flames. Together, they plot what becomes known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. If the name sounds fancy, remember, Brumaire is just the foggy month in the French revolutionary calendar, as they had a whole new calendar, complete with months like Thermidor heat and Brumaire fog. Imagine your birthday falling in fog month. Not exactly festive. On the day of the coup, Napoleon storms into the legislature, all passion and gesturing. But things don't go smoothly. At one point, legislators shout him down, call him a dictator, and may or may not threaten his life. His brother Lucien, presiding as president of the council, has to save the day. Lucien waves his sword dramatically and declares that armed grenadiers will protect the revolution from traitors. Soldiers march in, chaos erupts, and voila, the Directory collapses. Democracy is shoved out the door while Napoleon practically shouts, "Don't worry, I got this." Soon after, the consulate is born, 3 consuls supposedly sharing power. But come on, Napoleon is first consul, which is like being told, sure, 3 people are in charge. But one of them has a crown-shaped chair and a louder voice. In practice, Napoleon dominates, reshaping government, finance, and the army. He creates the Bank of France, reforms taxation, and stabilizes the economy. For a country battered by years of revolution and chaos, it feels like a miracle. You almost want to sigh in relief, almost quirky tidbit. Napoleon is known for working insane hours. He dictates letters at midnight, naps for just a few hours, then wakes and works again. His secret, he claims to function on little sleep. Historians still argue whether he really needed so little rest, or if he was just too hyper to stay in bed. Either way, if you try his routine, you'll probably collapse face first into your keyboard. Napoleon's political power grows quickly, but so does his reputation for theatrical flair. He has portraits painted of himself draped in Roman-style robes, as if he's already Caesar. His enemies mutter that the Republic is dead in all but name. But for many ordinary French citizens, bread is cheaper, streets are calmer, and wars are momentarily paused. Dictator or savior, depends on who you ask. Historians still debate whether Napoleon saved the revolution or strangled it in its cradle. One of his most lasting achievements during this time is the Napoleonic Code, a sweeping set of civil laws. For the first time, France has a clear, organized legal system. It abolishes feudal privileges, establishes equality before the law, and influences countries across the globe for centuries. Of course, it also reinforces patriarchal authority, reminding women that their place is still firmly under male guardianship. Progress with a side of regression. Meanwhile, Napoleon can't resist flexing his military muscles. He leads campaigns, In Italy again, defeating Austria at Marengo in 1800. The battle is chaotic at one point. It looks like the French will lose. But Napoleon rides in dramatically at the last moment, rallying troops to victory. Was it strategy, luck, or sheer drama? Historians argue about this endlessly. What's clear is that Napoleon always knew how to spin a near disaster into a legend. By 1802, Napoleon is no longer just first consul, he's consul for life. Democracy's looking more like a costume party that's run out of masks. Also signs a concordat with the Pope, repairing relations between France and the Catholic Church. This doesn't make him particularly pious. He once quipped that religion is excellent for keeping ordinary people obedient, but it's a shrewd move to stabilize society. The quirky part of Napoleon's rise is how ordinary he tries to appear. Despite ruling like a monarch in waiting, he insists on dressing modestly in his gray greatcoat, mingling with soldiers, and eating simple meals. He wants to look like one of the guys, though everyone knows he's aiming much higher. Think of it as a billionaire showing up to dinner in sweatpants. It's a performance of humility that somehow convinces people. As you drift with Napoleon through these years, you notice how quickly the man shifts roles. One day he's a general, the next a politician, then a lawmaker, then a would-be emperor. His energy feels inexhaustible and his ambition unstoppable. France, exhausted by a decade of revolution, seems willing to hand him the reins. The people crave stability, and he offers it, though you can't help but wonder what price will be paid down the line by now. Paris streets glow with new confidence. Shops are busier, families eat dinner without fear of food riots, and theaters fill again. Napoleon strides through this world like he owns it, which, in a sense, he already does. Yet in the back of your mind, you feel the weight of what's coming. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. When a man calls himself consul for life, the crown isn't far behind. Asterisk, you don't even have time to exhale before Napoleon takes the next leap. It's 1804, and Paris is buzzing with gossip. Posters, pamphlets, and salons whisper the same thing. The first consul is about to become something more. Republic, technically still alive on paper, feels like an old costume being tossed aside. And Napoleon, ever the showman, has written himself into the starring role. The French Senate? Under pressure, or let's call it enthusiastic persuasion votes, to make him emperor. To sweeten the deal, a plebiscite is held, asking the people to approve. Millions say yes. Of course, when soldiers are delivering ballots and newspapers, praise Napoleon nonstop. Choice is a relative word. Still, he gets what he wants: legitimacy. France has traded kings for emperors, revolution for empire. Now, picture the coronation. It's December 2nd, 1804, inside the Grand Notre Dame Cathedral. Candles flicker against soaring Gothic arches, incense curls through the air, nobles line the aisles in glittering uniforms. Pope Pius VII himself is present, ready to crown Napoleon, in the tradition of European monarchs. But here comes the twist. Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hands and places it on his own head. No priest, no divine right, just self-made authority. It's one of the most iconic mic drop moments in history. You can practically hear him saying, "I got here myself, thanks." Historians still argue whether this move was carefully scripted or spur of the moment. Some say Napoleon planned it all along to assert his independence from the church. Others insist it was improvised, a bold swipe at centuries of tradition. Either way, the image is unforgettable. A man crowning himself while the Pope sits awkwardly nearby, probably wishing he'd stayed in Rome. Quirky tidbit: Napoleon didn't just crown himself, he also crowned Josephine, his beloved wife, as empress. It's romantic, yes, but also strategic. Josephine's grace and charm win over Parisian elites, smoothing Napoleon's rougher edges. Behind the scenes, though, Josephine has her own anxieties. She hasn't given Napoleon a son, and he's already mulling dynastic succession. Imagine standing in a cathedral filled with gold and grandeur, knowing your marriage is teetering like a chair with one missing leg. As Emperor Napoleon wastes no time crafting a dynasty. He fills his court with marshals, dukes, and princes, many of them his family members. Brothers and sisters get kingdoms like they're being handed party favors. Joseph, his older brother, will be king of Naples. Louis, his younger brother, gets Holland, even his stepson. Eugene dashes around as viceroy of Italy. The Bonaparte clan suddenly stretches across Europe, whether people want them there or not. The French elite embrace new aristocratic titles, but with a Napoleonic twist. Rank is supposedly based on merit, not birth. A soldier who shows courage might end up a marshal. A lawyer who works hard could find himself ennobled. For all the pomp, Napoleon insists he hasn't abandoned revolutionary principles entirely. He's just upgraded them into imperial packaging. Meanwhile, the economy flourishes. Canals are built, roads improved, schools reorganized. The University of France standardizes education, ensuring a new generation grows up loyal to the regime. Newspapers are censored, but as Napoleon cheerfully points out, censorship means fewer confusing opinions floating around. People should read useful things, he says. Useful, of course, meaning things that praise him. The coronation and empire mark more than a change of titles. They reshape Europe's political landscape. Monarchs from Austria, Prussia, and Russia scoff, calling him an upstart. But deep down, they're nervous. Here's a man who started as a Corsican outsider, who rose through revolution, and now sits on a throne carved from centuries of royal tradition. If he can do it in France, what might happen in their countries? And Napoleon, being Napoleon, doesn't exactly try to reassure them. He issues medals, coins, and proclamations that glorify his rule. He commissions portraits, showing him as a Roman emperor in laurel wreaths or as Charlemagne reborn. He has no shame in comparing himself to giants of the past. Humility, after all, isn't part of the job description. Quirky detail. During this period, Napoleon also reintroduces elaborate court rituals. People bow, kiss hands, and wear ornate costumes to meet him. But he personally prefers his simple gray coat, the same one he wore with his soldiers. It's a curious double life. One moment, he's demanding grand ceremony. The next, he's chatting with grenadiers over black coffee, like an ordinary officer. Was this contrast genuine or calculated? Historians still debate whether he was a man caught between roles or simply a master of performance as he wandered through his new empire. You can't help but feel the weight of the moment. Paris is lit with festivals, theaters celebrate victories, and bakers even name pastries after him. Imagine eating a croissant inspired by Napoleon, though, to be fair. It might be smaller than expected. By 1804, France has traveled a dizzying road: monarchy, revolution, republic, terror, directory, consulate, and now empire. It's enough to make your head spin. Yet somehow, in the glow of Notre Dame, as Napoleon adjusts his self-placed crown, it feels inevitable. He has pulled France with him step by step, and the nation exhausted, hopeful, wary dash follows. Of course, every crown is also a target. By crowning himself emperor, Napoleon hasn't just claimed power, he's declared himself the rival of every monarch in Europe. And they're already sharpening their swords, ready to test whether this Corsican general can keep what he's taken. Asterisk, the ink on. Napoleon's imperial decrees isn't even dry before the rest of Europe sharpens its bayonets. The year is 1805, and the so-called Third Coalition forms Britain, Austria, and Russia, linking arms in a familiar anti-French dance. You could almost call it Europe's greatest hits tour, because every time Napoleon flexes, the same neighbors show up with armies, wagons, and stern letters. You march with him eastward, through muddy roads and fog-soaked fields, till the army reaches a small Moravian town named Austerlitz. Here, Napoleon sets the stage for one of his most dazzling performances. The French army is outnumbered, about 68,000 against 90,000 coalition troops. Yet Napoleon, with the flair of a gambler who's memorized every card in the deck, lures his enemies into a trap. The morning of December 2nd, at exactly 1 year after his coronation, the Battle of the Three Emperors begins. Picture mist curling over frozen ponds, soldiers stamping their boots in the cold, and the sun finally breaking through the haze. Napoleon himself points to the sky and declares that sun is the son of Austerlitz. It's not wrong. It becomes a symbol of one of the most crushing victories in European history. The trick? Napoleon deliberately weakens his right flank, making it look vulnerable. The coalition commanders, hungry for an easy breakthrough, rush their forces there. Then, like a door slamming shut, Napoleon unleashes his center, smashing through and splitting their armies in two. Chaos ripples through Austrian and Russian lines. Horses slide across icy ponds. Cannons bog down in mud. Entire units collapse. Mainstream fact: within hours, the mighty coalition is in tatters. Austria sues for peace, Russia limps home, and Britain sighs across the Channel. Probably doodling frustrated ships on government documents, Napoleon returns to Paris as the master of Europe, showered with titles and comparisons to Caesar and Alexander. Quirky tidbit: soldiers claim that after Austerlitz, French veterans carried the son of Austerlitz in their hearts for decades. Some old men years later would point to the sky on frosty mornings and mutter, "I saw it there." Argue it's the 19th century version of bragging about a college football win. Nostalgic, overblown. But deeply cherished, historians still argue whether the coalition's defeat was due more to Napoleon's brilliance or his enemies' bumbling. Some say his deception was genius. Others insist the Russians and Austrians practically walked into a ditch with blindfolds on. Either way, Napoleon's legend skyrockets. And the map of Europe quivers under his boots. But if Austerlitz is a high, there are also bruises. Across the Channel, the British Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, has its own sunless one at Trafalgar. Just weeks earlier, Napoleon's plan to invade Britain collapses when Nelson annihilates the combined French and Spanish fleets. Ships burn, masts snap, and the dream of crossing the Channel with French troops evaporates into sea spray. For all his brilliance on land, Napoleon's navy is basically that one friend who forgets the group project at home. So you watch him pivot. If Britain can't be invaded, maybe Britain can be strangled. Enter the continental system. A massive economic blockade intended to cut Britain off from trade with Europe. Sounds clever, but the problem is that smuggling exists, and people like British goods. You can ban sugar, but someone is going to sneak it across the border wrapped in hay bales. By 1806, Europe is full of loopholes, and Napoleon is frustrated. That ordinary folk seem less enthusiastic about economic war than about, say, coffee and tea. Meanwhile, he keeps redrawing the map. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient medieval relic, is dissolved in 1806 after his victories. German princes shuffle into new alliances under Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine. He's basically Marie Kondoing Central Europe, tidying up kingdoms, discarding emperors, and claiming joy sparks where he pleases. Another quirky move: Napoleon establishes the Duchy of Warsaw, reviving Poland after it had been partitioned out of existence. The Poles cheer, convinced Napoleon will restore their independence. Historians still debate whether he truly cared for Poland or just needed another army to fight his wars. Spoiler: the Poles fight bravely for him, but Napoleon never gives them a fully sovereign state. It's more like dangling candy in front of a child. You trail behind him into Prussia, where the proud Prussian army once feared a cross. Europe meets disaster at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. The French cut through them like butter, and within days Berlin falls. Napoleon parades through the Prussian capital, inspecting trophies and museums, even pausing at Frederick the Great's tomb. Standing there, he whispers to his marshals, "If this man were alive, we would not be here today." It's equal parts respect and smug victory lap. The Prussian royal family flees to East Prussia, begging help from Russia. So once again, Napoleon marches east. In 1807, at the frozen fields of Eylau, the two titans collide in a horrific winter battle. Snow, blizzards, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting leave tens of thousands dead or wounded. Unlike Austerlitz, this one feels less like a chess match and more like two kids smashing toy soldiers together until the paint chips off. The battle is indecisive. But later at Friedland, Napoleon finally defeats the Russians decisively. Tsar Alexander I, youthful and idealistic, realizes fighting alone is hopeless. At Tilsit in 1807, he and Napoleon meet dramatically on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. Imagine two emperors, One French, one Russian, sitting on fancy chairs under a golden tent, sipping wine as though this is the most normal thing in the world. Mainstream fact. The Treaty of Tilsit redraws Europe yet again. Prussia loses half its territory, Russia agrees to join the continental system, and Napoleon is at his zenith. Quirky tidbit. During the meeting, Napoleon and Alexander apparently got along famously. They dined, joked, and even took long walks together, while the poor Prussian king and queen waited awkwardly like third wheels. Some memoirs suggest Alexander was dazzled by Napoleon, calling him a man of destiny. Historians still argue whether this bromance was genuine or just political theater. By the time you leave Tilsit, the empire stretches from the Atlantic to the Vistula River. Napoleon struts through Europe like a man who's just aced every exam, even if he cheated a little on the math section. But the seeds of trouble are already sprouting. Britain remains untouchable, Spain is restless, and Russia-well bromances fade. For now, though, Paris glows, and the world watches, half in awe, half in dread. As France's emperor tightens his grip, asterisk by 1808, Napoleon's map of Europe looks like a child's doodle lines redrawn, kingdoms renamed, family members plopped onto thrones like Monopoly pieces. His brothers and sisters suddenly become royals. Joseph gets Spain. Louis gets Holland, Caroline marries into Naples, and Eliza lounges in Tuscany. It's less family tree and more corporate takeover with siblings as managers. Wander through this patchwork empire and notice the cracks forming. Spain, for one, refuses to play nice. Napoleon's decision to replace the Spanish Bourbon king with his brother Joseph sparks outrage. Spanish citizens mutter, "Who asked for this?" And within weeks, guerrilla warfare erupts. It's not glamorous on bushes, sabotage, priests, blessing muskets, but it's effective. French columns are harassed daily. Spanish guerrillas are like mosquitoes at a summer barbecue, individually small, but relentless enough to drive you mad. Britain seizes the opportunity, landing an army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Together with Spanish resistance, they turn the Iberian Peninsula into Napoleon's bleeding wound. Quirky tidbit. The British Army introduces its soldiers to Wellington bootsies, those rubber boots perfect for muddy marshes. Napoleon never. Intended to inspire a footwear fashion, but history is weird like that. Meanwhile, trouble brews elsewhere. The continental system, the grand economic blockade, meant to choke Britain's collapsing under its own weight. Merchants smuggle, neutral countries cheat, and even Napoleon's allies grow tired of shortages. Historians still argue whether the blockade hurt Britain more than France. Britain finds new markets in the Americas and Asia, while French households grumble about missing sugar and coffee. You can imagine the mood in Paris. Cafes less revolutionary fervor, more, "Where's my latte?" God. In 1809, Austria rises again, launching yet another coalition. At first, Napoleon stumbles defeated at Ospern-Essling near Vienna, where Marshal Lanz, one of his closest friends, is mortally wounded. Napoleon is shaken, kneeling at Lanz's side, clutching the dying marshal's hand. For a man so often portrayed as cold and calculating, this moment reveals a rare flicker of grief. Yet weeks later, at Wagram, he rallies, winning a massive but costly victory. Mainstream fact, the Treaty of Schönbrunn ends this round of war, forcing Austria to cede land and pay reparations. But Austria is not entirely broken. It will bide. It's time. Napoleon, meanwhile, seeks legitimacy through marriage. His first wife, Josephine, beloved but childless, is divorced. Enter Marie-Louise, the teenage daughter of the Austrian emperor. She's young, shy, and terrified of her new husband. But the union gives Napoleon what he craves, a dynastic heir. In 1811, the boy is born Napoleon II, dubbed the King of Rome. Parisians cheer, cannons roar, and Napoleon struts like a proud father at a kindergarten recital. Historians still argue whether he truly loved Josephine or simply bowed to political necessity. His letters suggest real affection for Josephine lingered, even as he paraded his new wife and son around court. Quirky tidbit. Marie-Louise.
I developed a fondness for Napoleon's works.
She later admitted she found his habit of working late into the night and dictating to secretaries while pacing endearing. It's not the most romantic picture. Imagine your husband muttering about tax reforms at 3 a.m., but somehow it worked. Back on the Iberian Peninsula, though, things deteriorate. French armies suffer defeat after defeat. In 1812, Wellington pushes them out of much of Spain, liberating Madrid briefly before retreating, then returning stronger. The Peninsular War becomes a drain on French manpower and morale. Napoleon himself calls it the Spanish ulcer. You picture him staring at a map, scratching his temples. He's muttering about ulcers not usually involving so many bayonets. Elsewhere, Napoleon stretches his empire too thin. He annexes Holland when Louis, his brother, proves too independent. He meddles in Germany, enforcing his civil code and conscription, and locals grumble louder with each year. The idea of liberty, equality, fraternity starts to sound hollow. When accompanied by French tax collectors and recruitment officers, still, Napoleon's empire remains formidable, like a towering sandcastle that hasn't yet met the tide. He controls Italy, Germany, much of Eastern Europe, and has allies in Austria and Russia at least, for now. Tsar Alexander I grows restless under the continental system, watching Russian nobles seethe as British trade disappears. Napoleon and Alexander's raft bromance is fading fast. The cracks spread further in the Americas. Napoleon's wars indirectly inspire independence movements. Spain, too distracted to govern, sees its colonies rebel. Haiti had already broken free earlier, sending shockwaves through European empires. Napoleon's reach is vast, but like a juggler adding too many balls, one misstep could send everything crashing. Mainstream fact: by 1812, Napoleon controls or influences most of continental Europe, a feat unmatched since Charlemagne. His legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code, spread equality before the law and modern administration far beyond France. Ironically, while his empire is crumbling, his laws endure for centuries. Quirky tidbit: Napoleon reportedly carried a vial of poison around his neck, just in case capture ever seemed inevitable. Once, during a desperate retreat, he even tried to use it, but the poison was old and only made him violently sick. Historians still argue whether this episode reveals cowardice, pragmatism, or just bad pharmacy. By 1812, though, Napoleon makes his boldest gamble yet. Relations with Russia collapse, trade disputes escalate, and Napoleon decides to march east. He gathers the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, the largest force Europe has ever seen. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, even reluctant Spaniards march under his banner. It's less an army and more a traveling city, stretching for miles, as you trail behind him toward the Russian border. Dust rising in choking clouds, wagons creaking, horses snorting, you feel the weight of destiny. Napoleon is chasing one more spectacular victory, another Austerlitz, another sun rising over battlefields. But the Russian steppe doesn't play by his rules. The tide, at last, begins to shift. June 1812. The Grande Armée steps into Russia, and you swear the earth itself groans under the weight. 500,000 men, thousands of horses, and supply wagons creak forward like an endless metal river. If you squint, it almost looks like the world's least fun parade. No candy, just cannon smoke. Napoleon rides near the front, confident, convinced that one decisive battle will force Tsar Alexander I to kneel. But Russia is not Spain, and the Russians refuse to play his game. Instead of marching out for a grand showdown, Russian generals adopt the scorched earth strategy. Villages burn, crops vanish, wells are poisoned. You trudge forward, stomach grumbling, surrounded by men already dropping from exhaustion. The air smells of ash. Historians still argue whether the Russians deliberately avoided battle or simply bought time until reinforcements could arrive. Either way, Napoleon's mighty army finds itself chasing ghosts. Finally, in September, outside a dusty village called Borodino, the Russians stand their ground. The battle is brutal, with cannons thundering, bayonets clashing, and neither side gaining much ground. You hear the crack of muskets like fireworks, except no one's celebrating. Mainstream fact: Borodino becomes one of the bloodiest single day Battles of the Napoleonic Wars, with over 70,000 casualties. Napoleon calls it the Battle of Giants, but he fails to achieve a knockout. Quirky tidbit. Napoleon's doctor notes that during Borodino, the emperor complained of a painful case of hemorrhoids, which kept him from riding his horse much of the day. Imagine trying to direct the largest battle in Europe while wincing every time you sit. Historians still argue whether his health issues affected his usually sharp judgment. Some even claim that a more energetic Napoleon might have pressed harder, possibly changing the outcome. After Borodino, the road to Moscow lies open. Napoleon enters the ancient capital, expecting triumph parades, treaties, a humbled czar. Instead, silence. The city is eerily empty. Soon, fires erupt across Moscow. Wooden buildings blaze, smoke curls into the sky, and the Grande Armée finds itself camped in ruins. Some blame Russian soldiers, others accuse residents of arson. Historians still argue whether it was an intentional act ordered by Governor Rostopchin or a chaotic blaze sparked by retreat. Regardless, Napoleon's victory feels hollow. He sends envoys to Tsar Alexander, waiting for surrender. None comes. The Tsar simply refuses to answer. Weeks drag by. Supplies dwindle. Winter winds whisper in the distance, and Napoleon faces the truth. Moscow is a trap. Reluctantly in October, he orders retreat. You march west with the army, snowflakes beginning to bite your cheeks. The Grande Armée, once enormous, crumbles. Starvation, frostbite, and relentless Russian attacks take their toll. Horses collapse, wagons are abandoned, soldiers wrap themselves in rags. One night, as you curl up in a ditch, the stars glitter cruelly above, as if mocking humanity's arrogance. Mainstream fact. By the time the army staggers back across the Niemen River, only about 100,000 men remain of the original 600,000. It is one of the greatest military disasters in history. Quirky tidbit, desperate soldiers reportedly boiled leather belts or ate horse carcasses, frozen stiff like blocks of ice. One French officer even joked that the army had invented boot soup, though no one was laughing as they chewed. Napoleon rushes back to Paris in disguise, fearing coups. Remarkably, he still manages to raise another army, proof of his organizational genius, or perhaps Europe's exhaustion under French rule. But the spell is broken. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain sense weakness, forming a new coalition. In 1813, at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faces his greatest test. Over 500,000 troops from multiple countries converge in Saxony before 3 days. Cannon smoke blankets the fields, musket fire rattles, and rivers run choked with bodies. You hear the thunder of hooves, the clash of sabers, the cries of men in languages you barely understand. Napoleon fights brilliantly, but he is outnumbered. When a bridge collapses prematurely during the retreat, thousands of his men drown. It feels like destiny itself is against him. Historians still argue whether Napoleon could have won at Leipzig if he had concentrated his forces differently. But in truth, his aura of invincibility has already cracked. Allies peel away German states rebel, and France faces invasion. By early 1814, enemy armies march into France. The French people, weary of war, no longer cheer as they once did. Napoleon fights a dazzling defensive campaign, darting between forces like a chess master on espresso, winning small battles at Campaubert and Montmariel. Yet numbers overwhelm. Him in March, Paris falls. Marie-Louise and the young Napoleon II flee. Mainstream fact. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicates at Fontainebleau. His marshals, once loyal, pressure him to step down. He attempts suicide with that old vial of poison. Once again it fails. Quirky tidbit. As he bids farewell to his imperial guard. Napoleon famously kisses the eagle standard and declares, "I cannot embrace you all, but I embrace your general." Some guards weep openly. You imagine standing there, torn between pride and sorrow, watching the man who ruled Europe walk away. Exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon becomes, of all things, a reformer again. He builds roads, reorganizes agriculture, and even establishes a new flag for Elba white, with a red diagonal stripe and 3 golden bees. Historians still argue whether he truly planned to settle into a quiet retirement or whether escape was always on his mind. Knowing Napoleon, you suspect the latter as you rest in Elba's balmy night air. Waves lapping the shore, you realize this isn't the end. Somewhere in his restless eyes, you see the fire still burning. And Europe, weary as it is, hasn't heard the last of Napoleon Bonaparte. Elba, 1814. The island seems too small to contain Napoleon's restless spirit. Stroll with him along rocky coastlines, waves slapping against cliffs, olive trees rustling in the Mediterranean breeze. He is emperor still, if only of a tiny dot on the map. Inspects roads, schools, even the postal system, micromanaging as if Elba were another France. The locals call him the Little Father, though you suspect some whisper, the restless prisoner. Mainstream fact, he has allowed an entourage of a few hundred soldiers, a court miniature, and a modest income from France. Yet soon, the money stops arriving. His spies bring whispers. Louis XVIII is unpopular, France is unstable, and so Napoleon begins to dream. Quirky tidbit, on Elba he stages mock reviews with his tiny army, parading them with exaggerated ceremony, as though 600 men could still conquer Europe. Historians still argue whether the Allies underestimated him or secretly hoped he might destabilize things again. Then, February 1815, you watch him slip away aboard the brig Inconstant. Against all logic, he sails straight back to France with barely 1,000 followers. The gamble seems insane, like trying to storm a fortress with a butter knife. But as he marches inland, something miraculous happens. French troops sent to stop him switch sides. At Laffrey, soldiers lower their rifles, cheering their emperor. By the time he reaches Paris, the city roars with support. Louis XVIII flees. Napoleon is emperor again. This period becomes the 100 Days. You feel the tension in the air like a bowstring pulled tight. He promises peace, reform, and stability, but the Allies are having none of it. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they all mobilize. Napoleon moves quickly, striking north into Belgium before their forces can unite. June 1815. The fields near Waterloo ripple green under summer skies. You march with him, boots sinking into mud from the previous night's rain. Cannons boom. Cavalry charges thunder, and muskets rattle like hail on rooftops. At first, victory seems possible. The French break through at Hougoumont, pound Wellington's lines, and launch cavalry that churns the earth into paste. But delays, coordination failures, and sheer bad luck tilt the balance. Then, late in the afternoon, Prussian troops under Blucher arrive, crashing into Napoleon's flank. Mainstream fact. Waterloo seals Napoleon's fate. His army collapses. He flees back toward Paris. Historians still argue whether Marshal Grouchy's failure to intercept the Prussians doomed him, or whether no maneuver could have saved him against combined Allied strength. Quirky tidbit. Legend has it Napoleon's famous hat was lost during the chaos, and later sold at auctions centuries afterward for hundreds of thousands of euros. Proof that even failure can be collectible. In Paris, his supporters waver. The Chamber of Deputies demands abdication. Once again, he steps down, this time in favor of his young son, though the boy never rules. Napoleon dreams of fleeing to America, starting fresh. But the British intercept him. This time, there will be no cozy island near Europe. Instead, he is sent to St. Helena, a remote speck in the South Atlantic. You sail with him into endless ocean, waves stretching like eternity, until land appears, barren, windswept, lonely. St. Helena feels less like exile, more like entombment. He takes residence at Longwood House, damp and drafty, surrounded by guards and suspicion. Days blur into routine, walks in the garden, dictating memoirs, endless chess matches. He complains of boredom, of the climate, of British restrictions. Historians still argue whether the island's damp conditions hastened his death, whether slow poisoning from arsenic in his wallpaper contributed. Mainstream fact, on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon dies at 51, likely from stomach cancer, though whispers of poisoning persist. Quirky tidbit. Before he passes, he reportedly asks for his ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine. His wish is only fulfilled decades later, when his body is brought back to Paris, laid to rest under the golden dome of Les Invalides. And now, as you stand in that grand tomb in your mind's eye, echoes of drums still faint in the marble halls, you reflect on the arc of his life. A Corsican outsider who rose to rule nearly all of Europe, a genius strategist with a weakness for ambition. A man both adored and reviled, remembered in marble and myth. The story quiets now, softening like candlelight at the end of a long evening. The battles fade into whispers, the sound of cannon fire dissolving into the hush of waves against a far-off shore. You picture the island of St. Helena at dusk, its cliffs wrapped in mist, seabirds gliding silently above. The man who once shook the world rests now, his ambitions finally still, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps across history. You breathe slower, imagining the hush of the Atlantic swelling and receding, steady as the rise and fall of your chest. The grandeur of Europe's palaces, the noise of soldiers, the roar of crowds all, have melted into nothing more than distant memories, like faint notes of a song nearly forgotten. And here in the hush of this moment, you realize how even the most relentless storms pass, leaving calm waters behind. The room around you feels quieter now. The air feels softer, the darkness friendlier. Let your mind drift like a ship rocking, gently at anchor, safe after a long voyage. Napoleon's restless energy has come to rest, and so can you. Close your eyes, settle deeper into your pillow, and let the tide of sleep carry you gently away. The story is complete. And so, for tonight, the world can wait.